Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of the Allia River fought on July the 19th, likely 387 BC, not the more famous 390, but this is the least of our concerns now, also considering that everything happening, let's say, before the beginning of the 3rd century BC in Roman history is consistently a matter of, say, chronological debate, to say the least, because of the historical and legendary background of it. Naturally, this was a real fact and also one of the most clamorously important for the Roman military, not just because of the Capitoline defeat, but rather because what this outcome triggered in the Roman military proper, that I'm making, as you know, a series specifically on looking at essentially the passage from the tribal to, in fact, to the manipular army, and that, in fact, today we will discuss. This is not a typically tactical history video of mine. It will fit actually in the battle series and in the tactic playlist as well. But we analyze here the battle, but also a bit some broader implication of the same, especially as far as Roman combat is concerned. I recently made a video about the non-existence of any sort of hoplitic army phase tactics in Roman-Italic warfare. So the Etruscan one, from which this would have allegedly been mediated, and there I, of course, spent myself profusely for 2 hours and a half. But again, you find everything in the Roman archaic warfare playlist. There are various subsections of the Roman warfare one, and this battle does prove essentially a moment of transformation, like every army constantly undergoes. That, however, highlights both the tribal background from which the Roman army was evolving, but also the new insight that had been already experimented practically by the same Romans, right? As far, especially as the tactical side of the story was concerned, always, of course, remembering that it is not much of a military issue just per se, right? Do not make the mistake of thinking that, of course, war must be studied just in function of politics or society. The histoire bataille is very important, as far as, of course, as you complement it with politics and society, and that's, again, why I referenced to you that video before. In any case, this is also a hell of a battle, right? This July the 19th of 387 definitely remained in history, and specifically in the history of Rome, as an inauspicious day, right? And this defeat on the Allia River against the Senonescos would never be forgotten, right? You can look at battle like Arausio, for example, in terms of largest amount of Romans ever killed on a battlefield, or the more famous Cannae for the deeper significance in the art of war, in the expansion of Rome in Mediterranean, in the actual victory that was morally, as Hannibal, as you know, was not able to break the Romano-Italic confederacy that had been molded, as we've seen exactly in the centuries that we're also discussing today, and in a very peculiar fashion, in fact, could have not existed if Rome had not been through the defeat of the Allia, right? So arguably the most momentous battle in the history of at least the development of the Roman art of war per se. Also for other reasons that are interesting. Recently I've been making some videos about Celtic warfare that illustrates also in fact the Gallic way of war that today we will deepen, of course. And when we look at this battle, of course, for a long time, right, of course, the interpretation of the same was more like a matter of, okay, this was a big deal. And then about what happened militarily, let's just look at some aspects and let's not be too fussy. But since from good 30 years now, we have found out a lot of things that about the Roman military that up to that point have not been really sorted out specifically, and that contradict what a much later historiography about the Roman army, right? Essentially also of Hellenic influence and, of a different time, probably in the same Roman history, wanted in fact to depict Rome like, right? Not understanding the uniqueness of her warfare and rather making the point, as we've seen also in the other video about the Serbian military reform, together with the one about the absence of a tactical, of an applicable tactics in Roman warfare, a sort of weird structuralistic stage making for which at some point back in time before, in fact, this very years, right, of the siege of Veii, of the Battle of the Allia, would have established a sort of Roman state, from which we call it Serbian reform because the king Servius Tullius with the second Etruscan one, but it was not likely even Etruscan but a Latin, would have established, and that would have been this stage in which the Romans would have allegedly copied the Hellenic state and phalanx, etc. And then at a certain point they changed their way of war, also because of a battle like the Allia, and turning to again the Manipular Legion. Except this step in between never existed. At least there is no actual historical evidence of this passage ever having occurred. And what we see rather openly, as we will see also confirmed today, is instead an incredibly gradual and, at least in the previous centuries, that the genesis of the Manipular Legion we will discuss hopefully soon, really. It's one of my favorite topics, was very fast in insight, but in as much as Rome expanded, and so the moral load behind it, and lots of other things we've seen in the series about the Roman conquest of Italy, but that was, in perspective, just an evolution from the traditional tribal warfare that was essentially, as we'll see today, also pretty similar to the one of the same Celts, and that took an important amount of time also to refine. Right, the Manipular Legion was essentially made by the late 4th century BC. It's what we call the Livian one, because at a certain point in those years, Livy describes it, but it wouldn't reach its full tactical maturity until Scipio Africanus in his Spanish, in fact, and African campaigns, right? And that's something that you don't have to give for granted as a military system, nor before, nor even afterwards. We will have time to discuss this. I already talked about this thing in the video about cohortal tactics and cohort organization, because where the hell did the cohort come from concretely? Like, why did eventually the Roman military at its peak came up with this? Everybody has, they're saying about the Manipular Legion, which is 95% wrong if it is on the internet for some reason, in groups, etc. And that, however, is very much connected to how the army developed later, right? And the cohort passes all a bit in the background. In any case, we will hopefully get there soon, and now we instead discuss this battle, this Gallic victory over Rome, that contrarily to what is commonly believed, seemingly did not bring actually to any Roman sack, right? There is no archaeological evidence of Rome having suffered destructions or sacks, etc., at the hand of the Gauls. What likely happened is that the Romans paid a heavy tribute after the defeat, but that's the degree of mythology that revolves around this Gallic expedition, by the way, that seemingly was connected with the Syracuse and the anti-Etruscan policy. In fact, what we hardly remember about this is that we are concentrated on Rome, but this army had actually devastated Etruria, right? And the Romans, essentially just after the expedition were to take this land over, also because it had significantly been crippled by these Gallic expeditions, right? But again, I count on covering all of history on this channel. If I live long enough, and YouTube does as well, there will be other ways to keep things online, but it's also a matter of time. So as I was saying before, in the history of military art, at least according to the interpretation that some scholars give by referencing Livy in his histories, that, as we will see, are basically expectedly and famously, I would say, about the Allia River for everyone, the only fundamental source for the battle. Then there are others, actually, but Livy 538 is notoriously the best tactical insight that we have. We'll talk about the sources slightly later. Here, also talking about Plutarch in his life of Camillus, for example. Some scholars, some modern historians, would see the given some references given by his historians that, however, do not quite say that the reform, right, of the Roman army through the introduction of the manipular tactics, and so also, by the way, the arms and armor that is associated with it, so from the oval scutum to the pilum. And this is, as we've seen, already wrong, because that thing was actually already there, right? Italic warfare was already about oval shields and heavy javelins, as much as basically all of sanitary Europe, except the Greeks fundamentally fought in a different way, really was. And we will have more time to explain this further, but we've seen it already in the other bit. Is about Roman archaic, feudal, tribal, whatever you want to call it, warfare, right? And the evidence that these historians would bring to the table would have been about the mere fact that this defeat, although immediately redeemed by Camillus himself, as you know, he basically ransomed the Roman loot, right, by crushing the Gallic army, in fact, burdened by the loot, etc. But this is within the realm of legend. Whether it happened or not, this is not really important. But the idea is that this Matus Gallicus would have essentially triggered a strong push for an incisive reform, if not a real revolution, which, however, never quite happened, at least in the sense of a merely technologistic change of weapons, or sort of, up to now we thought we didn't need to have a statile army. We will create it just because, we suffered this defeat. This is not exactly what happened. It's what happened in the battle, specifically, that the Romans likely sort of understood in insight to bring the need to accelerate or on a certain series of tactical development that they had already been experimenting, as we will see now, so that you can argue that this was really an important moment, but in the evolution from a much more similar sort of military background that the Romans had with other peoples inhabiting the Italian peninsula, and just at this point coming further throughout the century, by the way, gradually, as I said before, to a significant maturity, right? And in fact, there are great doubts about the idea that, for example, the scutum or the pilum, etc., would have been functionalized because of Camillus or whatever. This is not true, in fact, even for the Samnite Wars. I haven't really talked about them, but while there is no doubt that the Samnitic Wars definitely catalyzed further this evolution. It's not the type of ground or of, let's say, or enemy that mechanistically, right, and sort of technologistically influenced the adoption of certain weapons. Essentially, the Romans developed what we already had, and that would have essentially developed in that direction anyway, simply because of the broader Italic background from which they were fighting from. So, if you know where I come from with these ideas, you've either listened to my previous videos or you're somehow cultured in the topic, because I've never actually found a person online that got it right. I will perhaps disappoint you, as in this video I will actually not discuss this. I will make multiple videos about the genesis of the manipular tactics, but the Battle of the Allia River is a much needed background to this, as far as the tactical insight that we can derive from how, in fact, the Romans and the Celts were fighting in that battle. Right? What is that fundamentally dividing them? And in fact, it's not wholly clear even what this battle was about. It's a fairly archaic time, and the documentation is relatively abundant, right, for the times and places, but thanks to later historians. And so there are uncertainties regarding, for example, the actual formation that the Roman used in this battle. That is actually one of the most important things in function of the understanding of whether there was a sort of proto-manipular system at work, right, as it's likely, by the way. And that's what we're here to find out a bit more concretely. Livy, as we've said, is the source, right? Other also very famous ones, right, from Dionysius of Halicarnassus to even Tacitus, right, range from some additional info on the campaign to just anecdotal one about this clash that again was in the Roman history / legend a huge deal, right? And unfortunately for us, of course, we don't know what kind of sources Livy was using. I could even make a video about this because we know something, but precisely it's just... But also for Polybius, for example, and the later, in fact, full manipular, in fact, Polybian legion, as we call it, also for that very reason. We don't know what terms were used. These are also very important linguistically because there were uncertainties from the same Roman authors regarding sources that were Latin, right, and that were taken from sagas, etc. But as we've seen, the latter are very coherent, after all, through our historiographical and archaeological insight to appreciate a more, better defined sort of military background of those times. Surely individuals like Livy understood certain things of it much better than we could ever do. But this aspect specifically, and so the necessity of making sense of a battle throughout military logic, etc., is foggy, right? And so we have to be able to use things like analogy and certain archaeological evidence, for example, so that we can get also what certain Sibylline words or expressions really refer to in that context. We will use Livy as far as the political and strategic background is concerned, even though, again, there are different stories, but this is the best one, and there is not much of a difference, after all, about the facts and what happened. We know that this prestigious leader of the Gauls, of the Po Valley, Brennus, which is just a title, right? We don't know, just like Vercingetorix Rex, how the guy was called for real, but at least Brennus stems from the Gaulish Brennus in the Proto-Celtic Brigantinos, that is to say, someone preeminent, outstanding. A diminutive you find often also scattered in the Celtic word toponyms is Briganti, right? Which means high, exalted, and of course it has all to do with the in the European sense of divine transfiguration. So basically, the daily bread of all of everybody involved in this world, especially as far as tribal warfare was concerned, right? And Brandus, in the good season of 390 BC, again according to tradition, but 3 years later according to modern authorities, had gathered a large number of warriors from his tribe, the Senones, settled in central and northern Italy, and from others, by the way, in the Po Valley, for a military expedition, in fact, against Etruria. And today we'll not talk about Dionysius of Syracuse and whether these forces, that are actually a pretty sizable army, had properly been called to the south, to Sicily, because there are mercenaries that eventually appear there, and so there is all the question also, did Camillus defeat them really, were these another group's remnants, etc. So, but it's just hypothesis. We can't make a video about that because it's interesting, but there is all an interesting international background that we don't have time now to digress on. And so the activity of a Celtic warlord was, of course, pretty military nature, right? Brandus was evidently living off his fame of a great commander, exalting the fantasies of the various Celtic warriors, imagining to seize rich booty under his command, and therefore were motivated to join him, right? And this is why we have also such a large army. Now, especially for the Gauls, there are various figures given by the sources, to the point of, say, ranging from 15 to 70,000, right? So when it's like this, as a historian, I can freely express by my, say, military sensitivity just what this really was. And therefore, I can assert through my sheer military historical sensitivity that the Gauls were around 20,000 or more. As we will see now, the sources make it clear that the Romans were consistently less than the Gauls. We understand whether this was, a matter of sort of shifting sort of the odds historically to say, well, look, the Romans were a bit less. But there is enough conspiracy theory about pretending that the Romans were to smear, the Celts as barbarians, and that were, actually a super military power, more advanced than them. So I will not keep feeding on mental illnesses. And it seems also obvious that at that point, as we will see now, Rome had just doubled her territory after the conquest of Veii. But her army, as we've seen also from the pattern offered by the concept list of the Servian legion, would have made her field something like 6,000 citizen soldiers at this point, because they had started being paid, plus an equal number of allies, so that the number would be 12,000 in total. Some say more, but say also historiography in general tends to say that the Celts were so much more. We're talking about the beginning of 4th century BC Italy, right? So already for the Romans to field 12,000 men, they could have technically fielded more if they had, apparently, because this is what Livy tells us, they had dramatically underestimated also the Celtic threat that was thought to be something modest, that was not to make any, at the end of the day, significant change in the ratios of force, ethnically, demographically, militarily in the peninsula. The Celts could not wipe out the Latins, Rome, etc. I think it's fair to look at a 20,000 as also a substantially large expedition, which was a testament, by the way, just by these numbers, of the Celtic organization capacities, right? I'm not necessarily the military historian that tends to bring things to the smallest figures, but you have to consider the context, right? And again, 20,000 troops for a Celtic host at that time is a big deal, as much as it was actually 12,000 men for Rome, right at that point. In any case, there is this idea that the Celts could have been even many more. Also, we do not know their composition: foot, horse, chariots. We know, of course, they had all of the three, just we don't have a concrete idea of how they were organized, differently from later battles like Telamon, Centenum, etc. So a few years before, in 396 BC specifically, Rome had finally conquered and annexed, as we were saying, this historical Etruscan rival of Veii, closing, in fact, a conflict with the southern Etruscans that had lasted practically since the foundation of the urbs herself, and making this first substantial leap towards the conquest of Italy, because they seized the entire Veii district, increasing from one day to the next literally 60% of her territory. Right. This had been a momentous time in proportion to the capabilities of the Roman military, that already, as you know, through the siege, the introduction of the salary, so essentially a compensation for the military expenses sustained on a campaign, especially a long siege in a relatively far away place from Rome, some tens of kilometers fundamentally, was the first step again for that kind of statal control on the resources needed to wage war in such an orderly fashion. So Rome is really stepping further in civilization, and the same army that she can field now is slightly different. We will notice it during the battle from the tribal ones, or the feudal ones that she had historically fielded as a bit this clanic forces, not differently from the Celts, right? They were already substantially advanced at this point. The Latins were richer and more technologically advanced than the Senones and other Celtic hosts, right? And this war against Veii had, however, put Rome to the significant test of taking this step forward, exhausting her human resources, at least stretching them, importantly from a political, even before then, strategic point of view, so much so that in 406 she was forced to introduce the aforementioned form of reimbursement of expenses by the state that would have remained as the salarium, as a matter of fact, for those who performed military service. You know that even though we have the idea that in practice the Roman legionary from henceforward would be essentially paid even as an extra to what the state provided for its equipment. People think happened with Marius, but was already actually starting from now. There was in fact a sort of in-between status also in the early empire, for which technically you were responsible for the gear that the state provided you with, right? If, say, you destroyed your scutum at some point for whichever reason, you had to literally pay for it, right? This is a topic that I will surely discuss in another video, but it was technically still a thing, right? That these guys would get a salary. It was also an irregular thing, telling the truth. We're talking about pre-industrial society. There's not really a centralized state in the way we intend. So also the military is paid, it's supplied, etc. But there are still these sort of hybrids with the concept that it's mostly a duty as much as a privilege to be a soldier, even though Rome would later become mostly a volunteer army, right? At this point, the Romans were beginning to be that properly militarized people, so towards a professional direction of continuous conquest and expansion. that we described, especially again in that video about the conquest, in that series about the Roman conquest of Italy. But what actually this expansion was signifying is not authoritarian decision to like fourth estaters believe today, that there is the evil politician that decides to send the poor peaceful people to war, poor dears. Not just the entirety of a people is totally and exclusively responsible for every single thing that happens to them whatsoever, but in this case the morale of the Romans must have been rising significantly. Right, the same siege of Veii shows this dramatic moral load, perhaps even too much loaded with pride, right, as far as the capacities of the Urbs were concerned. It was a very hardly fought siege, as you know. In any case, Rome had been victorious, but this sort of state of mind, right, that had brought her to this first fatal, sacred endeavor was bringing her perhaps to overestimate, right, her own capabilities against other enemies, or at least to underestimate the latter, right? And from a political point of view, the Urbs found herself forcibly projected towards the north, right? For all the people who say also about, aside from all the things we debunked in the video about the politic tactics, but Rome, while developing her manipular tactics, was fighting exclusively with Italics, Celts, right? There were no Greeks around, right? So this scenario of the Battle of the Allia actually exemplifies that. Rome was looking at Etruria specifically, and she was therefore indirectly involved in the situation of the land, devastated at the time by the Gauls. Naturally had spotted this internal crisis, without which, in fact, also politically, morally, and culturally, you cannot explain historical phenomena. So much so that it had been the same Etruscans now that, as we've seen, had not had particularly peaceful relations with Rome throughout, her history, who had sent a diplomatic delegation to Rome herself to help resolve the matter peacefully, because they were exhausted by all these other issues. And so, of course, this was essentially giving way to Rome, asking essentially her to ask the Gauls if they could stop harassing their country. So the Roman ambassadors accepted, and they turned towards the Celts. However, they wouldn't shine really for equidistance, as they betrayed their role of mediators by participating in the fight alongside the Etruscans, right? This was a big deal because, of course, the Gauls were doing what they were doing pretty brutally, ruthlessly, and violently, and Rome wanted to seize Etruria, as she would not see it razed to the ground, which this waves of people from Central Europe had essentially tended to pick as their favorite activity. And this would happen to the Celts later during the Germanic invasions, as a matter of fact, and they called Rome in the same way. But this was the point. The Gauls had initially thought that Rome would, of course, take advantage of the Etruscan crisis, but they hoped that they would even participate alongside, at least they would take the spoils of Etruria as far as they were concerned, and the Celts their own, right? So at this point, the Gauls were pretty offended by Roman behavior. They abandoned their stunned prey of Etruria that was literally paralyzed by their activity. That again may have been even prompted by the Syracusans that had issues at sea with the Etruscans, so there is all this interesting background. And some of these Celtic war banders would actually go to Sicily, as we were saying before, and again, I just made a couple of videos about Celtic infantry and war bands specifically that fits perfectly the scenario. The point, though, here, Brennus deciding to march further south, right, towards Rome herself, right? And this was, of course, a measure to take satisfaction, but also, in the Gallic spirit, also a richer booty, right? Because Latium was starting to become a much bigger deal, of course, than Etruria, and at least the latter could, at this point, wait just to be finished off later on. Livy is keen to let us know that the Gauls were so determined in their punitive intention against the Romans that they marched resolutely and disciplinedly, right? This is important from an operational and strategical and logistical point of view towards Rome, especially with tens of thousands of men, by the way, saving, by the way, the territories they crossed from plunder in the process. So to act lightly, also due to logistical reasons, they thought that this was all territory that could provide them with supplies had they engaged with the Romans in more complex ways. But seemingly this was also about, in fact, having this dramatic showing off, right? This dramatic strategic projection to go strike the Romans. To say, look, we are in charge of the situation now. You cannot, mess with us. So, given the remarkable organization that Brennus had managed to give to his army, which again is early 4th century BC Celtic armies, right? They could, of course, cross even larger amount of territory, but the discipline showed here, the containment, the capacity of, say, envisioning a specific strategic objective with this clarity is striking, right? Really, this required, by the way, a great capacity from Brennus himself, right? A great control over his men, also self-control on their part, right? Which for a Gallic host is not really easy to do in a disciplinary way, right? And this is, in fact, the point of it all. Coming back home at some point, loaded with loot to the lands of the Senones or say in the broader north, right? Again, these armies were put together by bands of really many different chieftains that eventually could go on, right, across Italy, finding employers in the Mediterranean, but with different dynamics from the one of a 20,000 or more force concentrated just like that. So Gallic warfare was fundamentally about this raiding mechanism, like we explained often why, because it was already a big deal just to have had the political cohesion to keep all these men on the field obeying to a single leader with this level of order. All right, scorching earth behind would have turned the road home into a desperate race for foot. They were not willing to suffer that, while crossing territories that were still intact could have guaranteed the slow column weighed down by theft to remain well fed, right? Compact and safe from possible retaliations, by the way, because that is something we've seen in von Clausewitz. At that point, you have to billet your troops every day, scattered everywhere, and because if there is not enough food gathered in specific key points, and that exposes you to the enemy army, because you have to put together your forces with a degree of order that is quite complicated just by cultural background, plus if you put this dramatic supplying issues to it in addition. The Romans were taken by surprise by the sudden move against them decided by Brennus, and reacted, as it seems, without really taking this threat too seriously. I mean, they thought, likely that this was yet another band of some adventurers that, yes, had put together larger forces, but I mean, they're barbarians, come on, right? We already make war better than them. So they hastily gathered the available forces, which, given the time, must have been part of this phantomatic Servian legion of 60 centuries, for a total, in that case, of approximately 6,000 legionaries, to which we can add, as it would become the norm for the Roman army, as many allies, for a total of 12,000 men. This would be mostly Latins, right? So they were essentially identical to the Romans, and in this case, they also understood the relative problem that, given that now they were essentially connected with Rome for better or for worse, right? They would have suffered if the Celts had destabilized the situation. So this was not an hoplitic army, as people think that Rome so originally was. What, say, Greece taught the Etruscans, and through them Rome, could be at best, if the thing was not already developing by necessity in the development of the art of war, also in Italy, a battle order, what properly tactics means in Greek, that is to say, having this standard drill maneuvers that the hoplitic phalanx had, of course, mastered, made a video about the Spartan drill, for example, that is illustrated there, to have, say, a geometric formation that remains like that, so for which the troops have the specific training to maintain collectively during maneuvering, passing from column to battle line formation. So all things that, if, as we've seen, Rome was turning into a state politically and militarily at this point, would have been appearing just by themselves. But other than that, in spite of hoplitic elements in the Roman and Etruscan panoplies, there wasn't any tactical, say, copy of the hoplitic armies, not even properly in the nature of that type of warfare. That was very different in the Italian peninsula than in the Hellenic city-states. So all things, we've seen more open orders, at least, in fact, more attention. We see it from the equipment. So there were axes, big slashing swords, and again, this oval shields. There is not the so-called oplon, at least the aspects that developed in the hoplitic guys. The presence of heavy javelins, for example, that require different tactics. So it's a different world with a different military culture on its own, right? There was surely also a democratic separation. There were classes of recruitment that had, by necessity, in a city like Rome, already started to form themselves. The Etruscans had them, but they were also very different from the Hellenic ones, especially in the actual segmentation of the population. Right? In Rome, as we've seen, it was an elite that monopolized the entire thing, including the numbers in the army. Right? So a completely different picture than Greece, where more or less every citizen had the equipment for fighting as a hoplite, even less for Etruria, that had just literally a feudal elite, and the rest of the population were servants. So definitely not the egalitarian society that we see in Hellas. So with such apparently ragged troops, as Livy says, because the Romans again put them together quite hastily, and just to meet a threat that was not thought to be particularly significant, Rome prepared to block the way to the much more organized and numerous Gallic invaders. these were in fact already crowding the countryside when the Romans arrived, 11 miles from their own city, that is about 15 kilometers, where the Allia River crosses the Salaria Road just beyond the city of Crustumerium, that had been once a flourishing center, but that in those days had now been essentially depopulated due to the same Roman expansionism. Right, the Romans had not treated the locals particularly well during their conquest. So this we know the exact location, by the way, in the map that I prepared is well shown, really, with the details, etc. And we will see a bit better now the battleground, because that's what really interests us. So Livy 5:38, that's the reference. The author insists especially in describing the superficiality and ease of the Roman commanders, whose names, by the way, have not been preserved, so to erase their memory due to this infamous defeat. In fact, he says, I will not read Livy entirely, because literally what we'll see now essentially dissects everything he says, so you can easily follow the again, Livy 5:38 yourself, but there are some passages at least that are poignant. Here the military tribunes, without having previously identified a place for their camp, nor raised a palisade behind which they could retreat, regardless of their duty towards the gods, not to mention their duty towards men, without taking omens or offering sacrifices, they arranged their troops, which were extended towards the flanks, to avoid being surrounded by the large numbers of the enemy. Despite this, their front was unable to match that of the enemy, and indeed, by thinning their line, they made the center weak and poorly connected. Now, in the picture of the battlefield, you see what we're talking about. The Romans were legitimately thought to be in consistent numerical inferiority, and while they were actually defending, essentially blocking the path to the goals and deploying behind the defense provided by the Allia stream, they were in fact too few to cover satisfactorily the front of, as we'll see now, essentially 1,500 meters, with in fact a thick enough line, right? And this would actually cause a significant problem. The Roman center was meant to be stronger, so just for reasons that we don't have sort of the mathematical equation for which that would have been the case, but let's say we can imagine that there was, on the basis of the terrain or so what the enemies looked like, etc., good reasons for thinking that the center to be the most important part of the line, right? And this would essentially stretch them too much, would have especially the wings weaker, right? And the already the center was not much, and it was especially perilous to fight in these conditions. Then Livy says that on the right of the array there were essentially some slopes, the Crustumerian hills, right? Over the slopes of which the Romans deployed a contingent that the author defines as subsidiaries, right? Now, this term, as we'll see, is a bit vague, right? You could translate it as reserves. The idea is that the subsidium is some sort of extra force that is there to support, right, the main battle line. Apparently, because we don't know exactly now how many, say, there was a sort of battle line, of course, but how were the troops deployed within it in depth? Were there maybe other lines fundamentally, and or multiple layers aside from the first ranks, right, separated from it? we'll see now. And the reason why these reserves are named, again, is that they are placed on the flank to help defending it better. Right? By the way, it's not uncommon for Livy to use anachronistic terminology in his narrative, and we do not know the words used by his sources, unfortunately. What is certain is that if we were to think that the Romans were fighting still in the old tribal fashion and in the phantomatic phalanx that would have been there would have been just one battle line. Thus, such array would have not contemplated reserves. Right? It's not clear what Livy is referring to specifically. Right? Especially considering to support a flank, so it is not extremely clear whether here it's just to boost a flank, like to stretch the line further on the side, or to back like the line with other troops from behind. Furthermore, the development of the battle doesn't clarify this detail specifically. If this contingent of subsidiary forces had been about, for example, the dismounted cavalry of the Romans and their allies, the sources would have made it explicit just by habit, right? You're told normally they decided to dismount their horses because it was a big deal and it would have also required some sort of explanation. Whereas cavalry is actually never mentioned in Livy's story of the battle, right? So perhaps the author, in this case, wanted to mean that the troops placed on the extreme right of the Roman deployment were sort of support, not a reserve as such, perhaps even light troops of some kind, so not the heavy infantry, but there is room still for further hypotheses, as we will see. By the way, as we have observed, the Roman array followed the course of the Allia river. This course of water exists still today, except the Fosso Maestro, as it's called in Italian, precisely in the part of the battlefield that would interest us the most, has been transformed into an irrigation canal that runs along the Salaria Road, and that naturally is very modern today. Originally, it was intended to proceed inclined towards the southeast, flowing into the Tiber River, as the source dutifully reports, just below the road towards Crustumerium. Right, so you have the Crustumerian hills, you have the river, essentially you have the plain in front of it where the goals are coming from, you have the Allia in between, and it goes further west and it flows into the Tiber. Right, from the other side of the Tiber there is Etruria proper, so there is Bay actually, so if you go down the Salaria Road, that essentially the goals themselves are descending from the north, you reach Rome. Of course, this is clear from the map, by the way, but it's just nice to point out. You know, if you don't study geography, you can't really quite get military history at any level. And it's interesting that, of course, this place is located today in the Roman periphery, by the way. So just think about the dreadful reality of fighting and dying against the Romans just to be incorporated in their literal city later on. But anyway, the Roman array, and we will find, as we will see, further confirmation of this during the engagement, is therefore also inclined and to, as I showed in the picture, to better cover the territory. Right, it follows the hills, it follows the river. So this line assuming that it's only one, was deployed not only with relatively thin ranks due to the scarce numbers, and even more if there had been some extra unit in the rear, even another battle line, or even a third one if we think that there could be something proto-manipular going on, with the sub-units spaced apart from each other, so as to make the center of the army, the strongest part, isolated or at least distanced from its wings. That could be dangerous, because again, these are not the famous gaps between units that always exist and that are essentially have a standard, a minimum standard that is needed in combat to avoid these units to cram into each other and disorder themselves. These are substantial gaps, right? Spacing the units to a point of, problematic mass saturation, right, in the most important sections of the line, right? That is all important in itself. So if we count the aforementioned 12,000 men in two lines, say of 4 or 5 warriors deep, this could have covered about the 1,500 meters of frontage, which seems sufficient to close the space between the hills and the Tiber River along the Allia. Now, Brennus had the entire opposing side in front of him when approaching the battlefield, right? He could see the Roman lines, the hills on his left, and he was impressed for sure by the small size of the Roman host, right? With great tactical acumen, the Gallic chief thus assessed that the only danger in that situation, right, and considering that he was apparently an advantage, in fact, too much suspiciously even, numerically, could come exclusively from a possible ambush laid for him on his own left flank, exactly on the Crostomerian mountains, perhaps from an enemy hidden behind the subsidiaries that we do not understand. He probably saw, right, uphill, and or between the folds of the same hills, right? So that was the only part, say, concealed from his sight. So Brennus makes a very logical decision militarily. He had a numerical advantage, so he could pick some of his troops and sending them uphill to see what was there, right? So not to destabilize the entire formation in case they had moved all together against the Roman battle lines and something unexpected had occurred to endanger the entire formation, right? And this move alone, right, that is to say, attacking the very hills, thus also preventing a possible outflanking on his own flank, was by itself enough to send the entire Roman formation into crisis, right? Which went into panic, by the way, and fled without the enemy having done practically anything other than launch its own battle cry, right? The Gauls were quite famous for that. So the left wing deployed obliquely with its front to the northeast, and hearing the clamor of combat from behind it, and it instantly routed, the center and right wing immediately followed, leaving the men on the hill, by the way, alone to fight, but again for a short time. Either to get away from the noise, or because there were perhaps troops coming from the recent acquisition of Bay, which is yet another possibility, so not particularly motivated men. These forces on the left wing tried to escape across the Tiber and towards that territory, with the accompanying number of drowned in the river. All the others instead fled towards Rome, south along the Salarian Road. Right? It may seem, of course, Livy tells it in a more interesting way than I do, but it's literally what happened. Right? Of course, we can imagine, of course, a greater complexity even than the one that Livy states, but not in the essentials of how this tactical outcome unfolded. Right? There are, however, some aspects of this oath that are not clear as a whole. So, just to recapitulate, you have the Romans fielding some lighter troops on their right flank, uphill. The Gauls get suspicious about the fact that the Romans are so few. Brennus decides to send uphill some forces to clear the area and see whether there was any hidden party ready to ambush them or the entire Gallic host. There wasn't. The rest of the Roman line, as we've seen, was pretty stretched. Simply freaks out because they see the Gauls uphill on their flank, and the entire formation crumbles. Routing. Right? Now, Livy says something fascinating. That is, there was no loss in combat, but rather, and this is how he writes in Latin, terga caesa suomet ipsorum certamine in turba impedimentum fugam. And this passage can be translated in different ways depending on how essentially you think these troops were killed, because he's basically saying that the massacre of the Romans took place from the behind in that crowd of men who were hindering the escape by fighting among themselves. Right? Or you can translate it also as the rear troops were torn to pieces fighting against their own comrades because they hindered the escape. Now, the latter interpretation is more prevalent. In other words, it's as if the Romans had had two or more battle lines, and the front ones, by collapsing, right, were essentially running into the ones on their rear, and they got to fight against one another, right? Because somebody was telling them to keep on fighting in arms, right? And they were reacting to that. Now, this is a hell of a datum because, of course, it tells us that there were multiple Roman battle lines, right? This presents, say some further interpretational issues, right? Usually, the routes start from the rear ranks and not the front ones. It seems unlikely that thin formations such as those described by Livy. So, if we make the maths looking at the battlefield, something like 4 or 5 men in a file, it can create such dramatic problems if those in the front row, turn, and run away. Right? It would be different, and this, say, brief sentence would become more understandable if the Roman legion were already deployed, as we just said, and in this sense without Livy's knowledge that used to talk about the Manipular Legion later on, right? And that's where we get most of the information from about this. So if he wasn't one, say, writing about it here, it's because he didn't think that this army was like that. On to, in this case, infantry lines spaced apart from each other, which would have also had shed a different light on the subsidiaries arranged on the high ground, reclassifying them, if you want, as a true third reserve of triarii ante litteram at least. The absence of whom behind the other two lines of the main array would certainly have contributed to undermining their moral solidity. In other words, it's as if they had deployed the army in two lines, strengthened by a third line, making up, however, just the section on the right flank, right? So where the hill was, and where the Romans essentially counted to perhaps manage to hold the enemy, hoped to stiffen the line because the center was substantially far away from that. So if the Gauls had simply crossed the stream, went uphill, they would have simply dominated the Roman flank. They could have made other troops pouring there. So that's where the Roman command had identified at least a possibility for the Gauls to carry that out. It's likely that on the left, the distance was greater, as we've seen. The Allia goes towards the southwest tendentially, so it's an area that goes towards the river with somehow more difficult terrain, some sort of marshy one, and where they thought, in fact, that the Gauls would have not ventured, in spite of the fact there were so many, so that they could basically outflank the Romans, perhaps also there. Right, the hills were the better option in that regard for both. Right, and so this would make sense, right, and it would make even more sense considering that, as we know, the Roman Manipular Legion would develop on three lines. So we don't know again what Livy thought here, because the possibility is that maybe he sort of understood this, but he was unsure himself, depending on which sources he had, and we have no idea of that, so we can excuse him in principle, at least for our own ignorance on the subject. You understand that imagination here runs free, because think just about the famous checkerboard formation. The Romans fought like that. We don't have actually a clear understanding of that at all, right? Or whether there was a compact front line or a sort of segmented one, whether some was just a march formation, one of a battle line formation. I think that things were much simpler than they were. I don't think the Romans necessarily fought with a checkerboard formation later on during the Manipular Legion era, let's say. But we will talk about this in another video. In any case, these are notoriously as universally unknown and unprovable theories, because if you have just studied the very few sources on the topic, admittedly it's not that uncomplicated and simple historiographically to do so, but when you get to the bottom of the issue, you know that it's it, right? There is no other definitive evidence for proving, again, that the Romans fought in a way rather than another at that point. But in fact, let's leave this digression as well, and let's come back to the battle a little bit. So, as we've seen, the Romans were crushed pretty badly, right? Undoubtedly due to the outflanking maneuver that Brennus carried out, right? There was already a numerical disproportion of forces. This surely wasn't making the Romans so spirited just per se. The impression also was that the enemy was about to hit them from the behind as soon as they were outflanked. So the spread of panic and fright is surely motivated, right? In the absence of a clash, even worth of this name, it does, however, not seem that Rome would have been able to derive a particular tactical lesson from this engagement. I mean, what is that Rome should have done after having suffered this defeat against the Gauls for how we think they were fighting, right, with so simpler formation, right, imitating them. Why? This would have meant essentially involve in the art of war. They would have to come back to something tribal that also just they had improved on the basis of collective training, etc. So this was not the point. They didn't have to imitate the Gauls. Even less adapting to their panoply, even that the Roman one was becoming more sophisticated. And especially on the latter point, we can express some general considerations. That is to say, in Brennus times, the Gauls are in the Latin 1 period, right? So this stretches from the mid-5th to the mid-3rd century BC. Right? So in the lack of documentary evidence of the time, when we have to reconstruct the tactics of these peoples, we can only look at archaeological finds and dating them to see how essentially functional they were to that particular type of combat. So the Gauls of Latin 1 possess straight swords with double-edged blades between 55 and 65 centimeters long. Some of the largest examples reach 80. This confirms, by the way, the widespread opinion of the Hellenic Roman historians that the Gauls were essentially swordsmen, right, who used javelins almost just as preparatory weapons, like skirmishing in front of the battle lines as they were deploying. And these blades are definitely impressive. If it wasn't for the fact that the same sizes are to be found actually among the Italics as well, right? And the Romans were surely using. It's not all though, right? The Celts used the oval shield, easy to handle, with a central grip protected by a numba, which also confirms the fact that they used this arms dynamically and in combination with one another, right, and towards some sort of in fact individual ethos, right? The Italian populations used the same swords, right? The Italian examples of oval shields are even more advanced because they have an enveloping shape, just like the scutum, that offers a greater protection. And the scutum already existed at this point. So the fascinating thing about this is that ideally, we always think the story, the Romans copied weapons from other. Actually, they had already developed on their own without Celtic influence. Again, some scholars think that, and I disagree with the entire concept because I think that the oval shield was pretty much out there anyway, right? And that different peoples used it for the same type of tribal warfare, but some say that it was the Celts that actually copied the sort of heavier oval shield from the scutum and not the other way around. I simply say they used the same type of shields essentially, and because they didn't fight much differently in the first place. So remember always what we always said. Here we're talking about a Roman army that is passing essentially, in fact, from a tribal to a statal system, from individualistic warriors to disciplined professionals. And yet Rome is able to discipline collectively the former by making it become the latter, by maintaining effectively an individualistic mentality, right? The Roman legionnaire is not conceived merely to be finding information. That is obviously the most advantageous and effective thing, but the Roman legionnaire is trained to fight as an individual fighter as well, and dramatically so, and especially more at this point, in which we see that they were wielding the same exact weapons that the Celts did, in size and in general concept, and even with a even greater kind of level of sophistication, because if the scutum envelopes you on the flanks, you're actually being a more aggressive individual that needs to be out there with his essentially alone, with his flanks covered not by the comrades that use a flat shield like in the Celtic example, but essentially to be out there on your own on the basis of an average soldier. This is not to say that the Celts did not have an individualistic, aggressive ethos for which they would have an equipment in some cases that would push them forward, so in a more solitary way. But this is mostly for the elite and not for the average Celtic warrior, whereas the Romans, in their professionalism, are actually pushing the thing for every soldier, as it would happen later. So this is particularly important to understand the quality of the Roman army as a whole. So what was actually distinguishing the Gauls of Latin I? Mostly their spears, right? This is quite interesting. The tips that have reached us are mostly very long, even up to 60 centimeters, and imposing for a total length of 2.5 meters in some specimens found whole, by the way. The Italics didn't have much smaller spears, telling the truth, but it's likely that the Celts stood out here because, of course, of a slightly different way of war. First of all, these spears are not thrown weapons, right? They're eminently melee weapons, right? It's always complicated to draw an actual boundary between a spear and a javelin because there are certain types that are literally the same thing. But when you see, in fact, the most extremized specializations, let's say, you realize that these were pretty bulky melee weapons, right? Indeed, real heavy primary weapons, and we often forget this also about the Celts. This is something I really dislike as a concept, because one thing is understanding, yes, the war bands had more swords, were more precious because they looted them, whatever, but the average final rank warrior was primarily a spearman, and using the spear, even in individual combat, is actually a thing, right? Even if you're very skilled, like in this case, wielding a blade, let's say a spearhead of 60 centimeters, right, with a 2.5 meters length in total, shaft plus head, and you use this also, as we'll see now, in a individually dynamic way that requires an enormous training, right? Individually, admittedly not much from a collective point of view, but still, right? So this should make us pretty aware of how the Gauls from the 5th to the 3rd century BC fought, because aside from the fact that javelin tips are not very frequent in the archaeological finds, are actually and proportionally very scarce, we would see here a host, not of the typical wargamistic representation of the Gaul, like with a sword and nothing, but mostly as a lancer proper, right, on foot or on horseback. And actually, to distinguish the two things is not really sensible, because the Gauls had a true passion for horses, and they often fought mounted or dismounted, depending on just on the situation. So we must imagine them fighting with a spear fencing different from, for example, the hoplite. And of course a more individualistic one, because the collective push of the phalanx would rather favor the use of the hoplitic shield, while on the contrary, the idea of a thickly packed formation would be just disrupted by the cumbersome umbo that the Celtic oval shield at this point really has, right? So you understand that the average Celtic warrior here is more like a spearman, with the sword, right, being just a secondary weapon, and not the other way around. Likewise, and it's never the case, by the way. I mean, if you have a spear, it's because you use it as a main weapon, unless it's javelin practically, so that's another thing. But remember that whenever you think about the average Celt, it's a spearman, it's not really a swordsman. But it just didn't have enough swords in the first place. Again, the warbanders could, because they collected more loot, they killed more people, but the average, again, fighting rank, even though there was hardly, that kind of order to some degree, like they used clanic units deployed in fact, along a line that these leaders could be more or less capable, in fact, of arraying effectively. Brennus surely was one of them. They're much more aggressive also with the spear than you think. Likewise, the mutual protection offered by narrow oval scuta is less compared to that of wide hoplons. Yes, there is the thing that it was not called hoplon, but doesn't matter, right? By approximation, we call hoplon the shield. Nobody will die for that. In any case, that is the point, right? The italics, again, had the same type of thing. The oval shield is not a thing that you would also more functionally use in a sort of phalangitic order. It is thus impossible to reconcile this archaeological evidence with what some actual ancient but later historians tell us about the period. Because at this point, Rome was relatively influent in the Mediterranean, so the entire sense of writing about her story is something that emerged later when she became an empire, and some other authors wrote about this, right? So 13 years after Brennus' alleged sack of Rome, Furius Camillus met there is a beautiful book by Dumezil, as you know. If you've never heard of it, I would pose myself a question or two about the general interest in ancient warfare and religion. Met the Gauls again, but this is after even his victory over the loot-burdened army of Brennus coming away from Rome after at least a tribute was paid to them. This fight would take place instead, it's another one, take place on the Adriatic coast, right? So exactly where the Gauls were settled, by the way, across the Apennines. In the anticipation of the engagements that awaited Camillus, Plutarch, right, so writing consistently later, to say the least, in his Life of Camillus 40, illustrates a series of measures that Camillus would have adopted, fighting the Gauls would have adopted specifically for facing them in these various clashes, after the Allies, significantly enough. Quote, he knew Camillus, how the offensive power of the Gauls resided mainly in the daggers which they wielded without any style or technique, but with which they cut off shoulders and heads, which was a pleasure. Therefore he had helmets made of iron only, smooth on the outside, cast for almost all of his men, so that the enemy's swords would either break on them or slip off. Furthermore, he had the shields edged all around with a bronze ring, as wood alone would not have withstood the blows. He taught the soldiers to handle long javelins, and the Hellenic word used by Plutarch here is husois macrois. Husois is the term that the Greeks used to indicate the pilum. Specifically in this case, and instead of throwing them, to place them under the swords of the enemies to parry the blows. So this is fairly weird. For the problem that basically we are told, immediately we can see that the Romans had adopted some sort of long-handled javelins, so with a wooden handle, for coping against the sword blows of the Gauls, from some time before in which they didn't, and that they were reinforcing the shield's edge with a bronze layer because of the same blows, of course, deriving from those swords evidently. And it doesn't sound very logical, Plutarch, to say the least. This passage provides us with a, however indirectly because of the mistake, evidently an insight of how the Romans were fighting against the Gauls themselves. Right now, if the Romans again had equipped themselves with this long throwing weapon, the Macrois, by the way, how do you parry the blows of a Celtic sword just with a throwing javelin? I mean, this is not to say that I don't know, that cannot happen at some level, but the question is, why would you do it in the first place, right? You would at that point use preferably a spear, and still that doesn't answer how you're scared that the shield would be destroyed while the wooden shaft couldn't really. Here Plutarch seems to talk about the pilum, as a matter of fact. So aside from the fact that there is a difference between this sort of wood resistance, that it's different, the length of the pilum could be dangerous. To cope against a sword blow, as the same legionnaires' hand and wrist could suffer of the leverage caused by the hit, specifically. Used to parry, like here, that's what the source says, as evidently irreconcilable with the archaeological evidence. It's just a bit of logic, the sword's blows. It is possible that Plutarch was erroneously influenced by Polybius, who, recounting the Battle of Bergamon in 223 BC, states that the Astati, the Roman Astati, exchanged their pilum for the spear of the Triarii, precisely for the purpose of containing the sword blows of the Insubrian Gauls. Now, this may be something at least a bit more, let's leave aside what the shield story is about, at least it may have some sense, but it's relatively strange, if anything, considering that the Astati, only 2 years before, at Telamon, had generously contributed to the victory against yet another Gallic invasion, the last, basically, in Italy. And this is, of course, was crushed, and we will talk about the Battle of Telamon, because it is really interesting. So, even leaving aside all these incongruent data, right, what we would think about the wooden handle of a pole as being more efficient than the old metal tip of a pilum for blocking a sword blow should be the opposite, right? So it's actually more plausible that states less skilled in the use of pilum were equipped with longer spear to confront similarly armed men. We've seen that the Celts fought essentially with the longer shaft. That, by the way, still at that point would have been significantly used also by the Romans to some degree. And we're not entirely informed about the process, but we know that the Romans were changing something already in their equipment. But the sense is, of course, that, say, if there isn't any significant cultural divide, if somebody uses a long weapon, it's not much that the enemy is more comfortable using that too, but it's just something that they would do within their own culture themselves, so that it would have been produced for the same reason. So Plutarch is definitely wrong about Camilla's alleged indications, but he implicitly gives us another, say, information about the development of the Roman legion outside the alleged constraints of what would have there been, which there wasn't actually an hoplite phalanx, as the Greeks here thought. Also because the Romans had, in that later times, wanted, as we've seen in the other video, to essentially pretend that they had emulated the Greeks and they had beaten them on their own terms. Which is that in the time in which the Romans were creating their own statile army and the manipular legion was coming to be, so even changing eventually their own panoply to some more updated acquisitions that derived from these reforms, the Romans were practicing still, and obviously, a more individualistic use of the spear, the heavy infantry spear, and also acting with this weapon in a much more aggressive fencing technique, right? That was definitely similar to the one of the Gauls. I know that the spin-off on this latter aspect would say, where does it lead us exactly? Why should we appreciate this fact when looking at the Battle of the Allia River? In part, first of all, to prove again that the Romans weren't actually coming from anywhere near to any politic system. That the later sources are fundamentally wrong about what they thought about the evolution of the Roman army in that regard, that a Roman author like Livy understood better than an Hellenic one, even throughout partially unintelligible sources by that time to himself, and still, in fact, the Hellenic sort of mindset having had influenced the ways such things would be seen, and being more correct, in fact, about the actual, let's say, Roman military history through the same, in fact, Roman sagas and tradition that were talking and evidently referring about this thing. The guys that turned back and that are starting to find, like the others that don't want to make them break and flee, is even for the same author of, in fact, the Livian Legion as a historical description after essentially at the end of the 4th century BC, when throughout this century that legion had developed. The actual existence of multiple lines of infantry that were already operating in a way going towards the triplex Accius, for which the Manipular Legion is renowned and characterized by. This is also very important. Why? Because first of all, we do not. These are important conceptual steps. This video is sort of bridges between the ones I created. For one side, we know that the Romans began at some point, of course, to think of this triplex order that was based, as we'll see better in the future, on the, say, most obvious concepts of course, of the use of reserves, of gradual expenditure of energies, etc., and that require certain type of troops control, also of battle line alternation in combat. So these things we'll see, and so they pertain to something more developed than the, say, tribal battle line. Yet we do not know exactly, in fact, when this passage would have occurred, right? Because we do not, even if, of course, we know, we can see where the manipulator region was established, we cannot exactly say how back in time it dates. Likely, it's something that they were experimenting from this battle, the Battle of the Allia River, because through what Livy says, even not so explicitly, because probably he didn't fully acknowledge this himself, but he may have even been that subtle to leave us the actual evidence of that, because, if you write that, it's obviously implicit that there is somebody who is breaking the ranks, like, let's say, and running into somebody else in the rear. It's not just a single line with a single rank. There are, multiple ones, and it seems, say, more concrete. Also, as a general information, if this had happened within a single battle line, probably would have not been news in an historical account, right? The idea that it's the guy from the first rank or the rear rank, that's how it actually happens, right? From which the route usually starts. Here, I think Livy was aware of the fact that there were already multiple battle lines, and perhaps he's not letting us know explicitly not to confuse his own later insight on the story. And this would be a very interesting way of thinking late Republican historiography regarding this. And this opens also a question, like, say, how long this was going on from, right? Is it something specifically connected with the statalization of the Roman army, the siege of Veii, exactly in that generation, or was it something already practiced by the tribal army? And how much did this fit, let's say, the idea of the so-called Servian legion, and or the establishment of sensual classes of recruitment in this regard? Because as we've seen, at least in the Servian legion, the concept is that the first class, the heaviest, right, so that made the bulk, say, of the army, was in fact the most numerous. Also, it basically counted 2/3 of the entire line. So it is something similar to a single battle line, like the one of the Greeks, not because there was an influence in that regard, but because it would be simpler to fight, right, for an elite that was yet to open to the masses in that way. So when we look at Livy subsidiaries here, it's as if we were looking at and thinking of two battle lines, which is not entirely clear. At least that these subsidiaries may have formed one, right? And we are not sure whether there were 2 or 3 lines, that the latter of which could have been, in fact, one of the subsidiaries with 2 larger, say, 2 heavier ones of heavier infantry. And this would make sense, because if we consider that the lower classes of recruitment were, in fact, poorer and weaker, and also more numerous, it sounds like, at the Battle of the Allia River, these 2 blocks, let's say, of heavier guys could have been the result of, say, of the split of the original class into battle lines, at least in a tactical, just contingental reason, because of the battle plan and the array, to increase, right, that sense of, again, the possible use of reserves, etc., and gradually fort. And so already looking at sort of proto-manipular thing, especially considering that, especially this double array would have spaced even more the various subunits in the various lines. And the third line of the subsidiaries being made up of lighter troops, of troops that were not even supposed to do that much, but that could still reinforce, in this case, what we have seen as the, let's say, the weaker point, the one that could crumble, the part which the Gauls could, in fact, as they would, use their numbers to test the ground and even winning. So the take from the battle is just, I don't think I'm going to make another video about the battle of Allia, because it's literally more or less what we looked at. It's just a levy, and in fact I decided to add this other thing just to reflect more diachronically and comparatively on Roman warfare, the Celtic one, and the general take that we have towards, let's say, the Roman military at the roots of her existence. But also because it makes you see that the Romans from one side had surely already been experimenting with this multiple battle lines thing, even to the point of preferring the concept of reserve here in a likely, at least, because it's not entirely clear, even from Livy, as you understand, this reserves, even when they had a pretty scanny front line as far as the depth and the thickness of it was concerned, because of general numerical inferiority at this point. But it is also likely that the Battle of the Allia River, aside from shaking dramatically the Romans as far as, look, the Gauls have come to humiliate us, there is the sense of revenge, the sense of threat that would boost further the statal development of Rome politically, not just militarily. From the latter point of view, you realize that this defeat pushed dramatically the Romans to boost further the sense of in-depth army, because they had crumbled simply as they had been outflanked, right, even when using reserves in this regard. And the reason being that these reserves were, say, this army was inadequate, but it would have still been inadequate if, for example, it had been, say, numerically, but even more would have it been if they had deployed the army on a single line, because at that point the Gauls could have simply outflanked the Romans once after having crushed the right wing and making the system collapse even worse. Just as a single battle line that you spend just in one moment, it's not meant to intervene with any reserve from the rear, etc. So this aspect, I think, is important, because later on the Romans would definitely make good use of this system. It would not actually or necessarily prevent simply outflanked, because being outflanked, generally speaking, was bad news for everybody involved in every situation. And aside from the fact that, unfortunately, we do not know how spaced the manipulator lines were, which probably was even as far as half a kilometer sometimes, so nothing say different from other armies in history, telling the truth. It would have, saying, had more chance not to fall all at a time when outflanked. All right. So this aspect is particularly interesting because the Romans surely thought at this point it was necessary to even increase further the number of troops, that they needed to in fact render it possible for the inclusion in the army of an more open segmentation, for creating, in fact, what we know as a democratic segmentation, one of the Astati, the Principes, and the Triari, that was, to us, it seems so natural, but naturally archaic among a people, say, it was fairly warlike and tribally, originally like the Roman one, but that originally was not meant to be a people as such, because the first line was the only one that mattered, practically, and almost the only one that existed, even as a Roman army. And so when you realize what happened with the Triplex Accius, the thing essentially thickened these battle lines in a more equal way. And so from the prototype of the Serbian reform, what you get is actually a further dilution of this elite throughout through the extension of the citizen rights, fundamentally, and the thickening of the ranks, the presence of the stati that were the poorer and the younger, right, and all the way up through the heavier and more experienced units, right? And so the Manipur religion that we know. So the Battle of the Allia River showed that brutally, because again, there was nothing really to be told by the Gauls here, right? The Gauls did not contribute significantly in the development of the Roman art of war, right? It was an internal thing due to the factors, namely the spiritual reason why Rome decided to grow the way she did, and giving herself this statal profile that was the most obviously advantageous, especially now that she was expanding far beyond for a permanent occupation of the neighboring peoples. And that, however, showed that the uncertainty regarding these reforms, they were gradual. We don't even know that there was probably a lot of back and forth as well as in the decisional phase, was dangerous, because an army sent with such few amount of people that were presumably also the richest ones, as the Servian reform was basically, at least for what we think it was historically, was still that relic of clanic feudal. There are just a nobility that fights and the others do not have rights, into something more, in fact, comprehensive in nature, that required the real extension of rights to people that wanted to fight, that wanted the new land, as we've seen, that were otherwise sinking into debt into the lands of the great landholders, and that now, as soldiers, to conquer other peoples, were given a chance to make this enormous moral and material resources of Rome booming and being used to the best of that employment. So imagine there is a political debate revolving around this. The Battle of the Allia occurs, and Rome gets humiliated in the pay of a tribute to a barbarian people. For what? Right? If you needed to fight and strike back, as Rome would do successfully, she had to fuel her armies with much larger amount of troops, and this required accepting that it would get essentially a part of the imperium that historically had been just in the hands of the nobility, and that now instead was extended to the Roman people, as it was becoming, not just a set of clans that had made Rome. So this is the actual meaning and the enormous importance of the Battle of the Allia, because from here we can start, first of all, documenting the actual development of the Manipur Legion as types of reserves, right? At least in the way it would get the Triplex Accius in a more pre-orderly fashion. Then, of course, we can think in tribal times this was not so strange, right, to have multiple ranks here and there, but originally it wasn't conceived necessarily to be so. It required more sophistication and development, etc. And because from this moment onwards we see Rome doing nothing but dramatically developing this entire system, and again with equally dramatic success of unprecedented scale in human history. So that in less than a century, the Manipular Legion would be there, based on, again, an insight that is also substantially different from the one of the, again, just the best, the heaviest, the oldest, the richest fight in the front, but actually the other way around, as a sort of, you wanted the right to fight in the army, just we send you first, right? And you are the poorest, the youngest, and least accomplished. If you prove to be also the more courageous, you will get something. You will rise through the ranks of Roman politics and society. This is the idea. Through the victories, through the spoiling of the enemy lands, etc. This is really the meaning of it all. So, again, at a first glance, it could not be so evident that this battle even changed too much, because aside from, say, the way or the reason people quote this battle mostly is the Gauls defeated Rome or sacked Rome after this. This was the most terrible thing ever. It was just one of those events in ancient history that changed everything. It's not really that, right? It's the fact that this gave the further reason for Roman politics to see what kind of path they had to follow in order to create what we know as Rome, and the transfiguring effect on the entire mankind after it. And based on this redeeming principle, after all, and not a sort of restrictive one. But let's see what you can do, unveiling human potential in holy combat and getting to divine rule on the world. So this is the interesting aspect, right? Dramatic moral effect, but also dramatically unique Roman military culture dynamics that are truly, like, there's no other people in the world that followed this pattern, at least that I think is historically documented, right? Rome was the only one who passed truly from a tribal order of this kind to one that, in such a short time, by the way, into a professional one, taking over basically everything from literally one single city. This is something that we don't picture that easily. We tend to conflate, say, a broader picture of Romanity with a sort of broader picture of classical, also paralleling with the Greeks, etc. But it's a completely unique and radically and brutally different way. This thing was scary just as much as the Gallic host, much more scary actually than the Gallic host at the Battle of Allia that didn't kid either, right? And so, from the Celtic point of view, you can appreciate the size of a Gallic host in central Italy for how it was able to maintain control on its forces, how they could move across hundreds of kilometers, making sensible strategic and tactical decisions, and definitely showing there an enormous courage and, again, cohesion, to say the least, right? Identifying immediately the issue and managing to crush Rome, and even going as far as, intimidating her, albeit apparently with also dire consequences for the Gauls. Not much immediately, at least if we take Camilla's ransom for good, it's it's already something, but later on, as Rome would literally overwhelm these people without too much of a problem later on. So we will keep talking really a lot about this stuff, because there's plenty of info that is important to be laid out there. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.